Page 245, continued. A complex age, para. The Victorian era was an age of rapid flux and baffling complexity. Moody and Lovett aver, quote, never before, not even in the troubled 17th century, had there been such rapid and sweeping changes in the social fabric of England, colon, and never before had literature been so closely in league or so openly at war, with the forces of social life, stop, unquote. It is hazardous to sum up an age in a formula, semicolon, and it is particularly hazardous to sum up in this fashion the Victorian age. Two features make such a thing particularly difficult. One, the very rapid and sweeping changes which the age witnessed, and two, the complexity of social forces operating in the age at any given moment. Para. The words of A.C. Ward are very apt here. Quote, one of the irritating characteristics of the Victorian age is its refusal to be covered by any of the commendatory or derogatory labels from time to time attached to it. Stop. It was an age of faith and an age of doubt, semicolon, an age of morality and of hypocrisy, of prosperity and poverty, of idealism and materialism, of progress and decline, of splendor and squalor, stop. It was a solemn age, yet it produced more humorous writers than any other single period, colon. It was advanced in intellect, yet immature in emotion, stop. And though as an historical period it lasted for more than 60 years, disintegrating forces were pecking at its foundations 40 years or more in advance of Queen Victoria's death in 1901, stop, unquote. The literature of the age reflects this complexity and is also influenced by it. Stop. Para. The development of science. The two most important features of the Victorian age were, one, the development of science, and two, the progress of democracy. Para. We now propose to discuss at some length these features in all their important ramifications and, of course, their impact on contemporary literature. Now, for the development of experimental science. Para. The rapid development of physical science in the Victorian age transformed the material environment of the people and both directly as well as indirectly made itself felt in the literature of the age. The age witnessed a great outpouring of scientific literature. Such epoch-making works as Darwin's Origin of the Species came out in this age. But more important than such direct influence was the indirect and almost ubiquitous influence which the rapid development of physical science exerted on Victorian literature. Quote, the advancement of science, unquote, says Compton Rickett, quote, has transformed man's outlook upon life and has affected every channel of intellectual activity. Stop, unquote. In what respects did this transformation come about? First, it encouraged a materialistic outlook. The, quote, otherworldliness, unquote, gave place to, quote, this worldliness, unquote, stop. Commercialization of all human activities soon followed, accompanied by a marked shift in the values of life. Materialism and commercialism inevitably lead men to restlessness as much as hectic activity. The, quote, busy hum of men, unquote, was alien to all spiritual repose. Well could have another Wordsworth lamented, the world is too much with us, semicolon, let and soon, semicolon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, colon. Little we see in nature that is ours, stop. Para. No doubt Victorian scientists started, quote, seeing, unquote, much in nature, quote, but not in the Wordsworthian sense, stop. To them nature was non-human as a spider or a weed which is so nonchalantly cut up and read lectures upon. Para. Secondly, the development of science was instrumental in nurturing, even among the literary writers, the peculiar scientific temper. Some of them even had a recourse to, quote, scientific, unquote, methods in their literary works. Tennyson, for instance, followed as a poet the scientific method of description which puts a premium on the accuracy of detail. His nature poetry is, according to Compton Rickett, quote, like the work of an inspired scientist, stop, unquote. In the historical literature of the age also, the scientific temper seems to be at work. Carlyle, who was bitterly opposed to science in other ways, Buckle and many others adopted as historians the scientific method of discovering and orienting accurate facts and relating them to the psyche of an age. The method of induction and rigorous research was essentially scientific. In the realm of fiction, too, the invisible hand of science was definitely at work. About this aspect, Compton Rickett maintains, quote, in fiction, page 246, the scientific spirit is in less discernible, colon. The problems of heredity and environment preoccupying the attention of the novelists, stop. The social problems, S-I-C, meaning mistake, of the earlier Victorians, of Charlotte Bronte, Dickens, Kingsley and Reid, give place to points in biology, psychology, pathology, stop. The influence of Herbert Spencer and of Comte meets us in the pages of George Eliot, colon. While the analytical methods of science are even more subtly followed in the fiction of George Eliot, the early writings of Mrs. Humphrey Ward and the intimate Wessex studies of Thomas Hardy, stop, unquote, para. Thirdly, the development of science caused a marked spiritual disturbance, which often took the shape of skepticism and sometimes of patent agnosticism. Mid-Victorian poetry is particularly shot with the tincture of this spiritual disturbance caused by the sudden crumbling of the age-old edifice of Christian values. Illustrating this point, Compton Rickett observes, quote, the questioning note in Clo, the pessimism of James Thomson, the wistful melancholy of Matthew Arnold, the fatalism of Fitzgerald, all testify to the skeptical tendencies evoked by scientific research, stop. It did not kill poetry, but it stifled for a while the lyric impulse and overweighted verse with speculative thought, stop, unquote. The last sentence is overtrue and should, with advantage, be considered with respect to the poetry of the Victorian age to see the striking difference which the development of science brought about in the general complexion of poetry. Only a handful of writers such as Browning remained undisturbed. Browning could write, God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Para. But that opinion is very unrepresentative, being limited only to such incorrigible optimists as Browning, who are rare not only in the Victorian age but in any age. Arnold with his plaintive doubtfulness and Tennyson with his inquisitive note, in memoriam, are much more typical in this respect. Para. Fourthly, the development of science led England to the Industrial Revolution, which started, no doubt, about 1760, but found its real climax only during the Victorian Age. This revolution brought in the economic and social changes arising out of the replacement of industries carried on in the home with simple machines by industries in factories with power-driven machinery. On account of the excessive significance of the Industrial Revolution, we will discuss it under a separate subhead. The Industrial Revolution. Para. The Industrial Revolution ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity. But on the side of debit, it converted the, quote, merry England, unquote, into a sooty and squalid England, and it also gave rise to a number of social problems which are the inevitable bane of industrialization. With the conversion of the agrarian economy into industrial economy was created, on the one hand, a new class of privileged mill owners and big industrialists, and on the other a huge horde of ill-clothed and ill-fed laborers whose rights were yet to be protected over the years by a long succession of legislative measures. There was a virtual exodus of people from the country to the numerous towns which had started resounding with the grind and buzz of heavy machinery. The policy of laissez-faire, as expounded first by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, was seized upon by the Victorian political economists like Mill, Malthus and Ricardo, and applied to the working of the new industrial system. This application was tantamount to the denial of all rights to the labor except perhaps the right to starve. Mayhew in his work London Poor paints a harrowing picture of the miserable life of the working classes of Victorian London. The intransigent political economists for a number of years succeeded in preventing the government from saving the poor from the merciless exploitation of the capitalists. Thus, the Industrial Revolution proved much less than an unalloyed blessing. Para. The so-called political economy and the pontifical utterances of its champions did not go unattached. Carlyle and Ruskin did their best to strike at the foundation of this, quote, science, unquote, which Ruskin called, quote, nescience, unquote, stop. Whereas Carlyle spoke as an inspired prophet, Ruskin combined the inspiration of a prophet with the hardcore of a dialectical skill that he displayed effectively in Unto This Last, which he called the greatest work of his life and which incidentally influenced Gandhi a great deal by helping him to form many opinions of his own. Most of Ruskin's later works are imbued with the spirit of social reform. Dickens also displays in his novels a soft corner for the miserable poor, their wretched dwelling places, and their poor and squalid lives. Stop. Page 247. His novel Oliver Twist, for instance, contains some very realistic pictures of London slums, and Hard Times is an unveiled and calculated attack on the contemporary political economy of the school of Gradgrind, who figures among the chief protagonists of the novel. Dickens is nothing if not a social satirist. As Compton Rickett put it, comma, quote, for the motley multitude that pour through the streets, comma, for the hole and corner places of the city, comma, for London as an incomprehensible, comma, terrifying, comma, fascinating, comma, delightful personality, dash, every brick and stone live with tragic humor, hyphen, Dickens remains unrivaled, stop, unquote. Dickens was not only a realist, however, but a satirist, and a very brilliant satirist at that. We cannot entirely agree with Cross, who opines, quote, "The attacks of Dickens on science and political economy are hysterical curiosities," stop, unquote. If we remove the elements of fantasy, we will get at a very small but a very genuine core of hard common sense. Stop. The progress of democracy, para. Basically, the whole progress of English political history is the movement from uncompromising royalism to uncompromising democracy. In the Victorian age, this shift was considerably accelerated under the impact of various operating factors. Stop. Starting with the year 1832, several reform bills were enacted, which progressively granted voting rights to more and more people, ultimately ending in universal adult suffrage. As a result, the House of Commons remained, in Compton Rickett's words, quote, "no longer an oligarchy," stop, unquote. It was only then that the expectations raised by the French Revolution, 1789, came to be fulfilled. The impact of democracy on the literature of the age is evident. One of its important manifestations is the keen interest which the writers of the age evinced in the hopes and fears of the poor people and in, quote, low life, unquote, as a whole. Most Victorians, it is true, believed in a kind of caste system, and what Thackeray called snobber, and sniffed at each other like dogs when two of them met. But almost all writers stood for the demolition of these artificial social barriers and the recognition of the inalienable humanity of the underdog. No writer worthy of note seems to be unaware of the process of rapid democratization of the political system. The common man comes and stays as the hero of most works of literature. This process brought in its wake increased educational opportunities for the poor. There was thus a rapid expansion of the reading public, who became the new patrons of literature. The writer was thus compelled to cater for these new classes of readers. The democratic spirit of Victorian literature has thus to be studied with reference to the readers also. The unprecedented expansion of journalistic activity is also to be considered likewise. The serialized novels of Thackeray, Dickens, and others are a peculiar product of their age. The poets of the Victorian age, para. Tennyson is, in the words of W.J. Long, quote, probably the most representative literary man of the Victorian era, stop, unquote. His work is an authentic epitome of all the important features of his age. Stop. Whatever be our estimate regarding his greatness as a poet, and most modern critics are convinced of his mediocrity, there can be no doubt about his representative value of his work. Stop. He is a good representative and chronicler of his age, as Chaucer, Spenser, and Pope were of their own respective ages. Stop. Tennyson's career as a poet extended over more than half a century, during which period many changes occurred. Stop. In his poetry he kept pace with the changing times. Stop. Stopford Brooke says, Cologne, quote, for more than 60 years he lived close to the present life of England, as far as he was capable of comprehending and sympathizing with its movements, semicolon. And he inwove that he felt concerning it into his poetry, stop, unquote. There seems to be some printing mistake in the quotation. It does not mean, however, that he had no individuality of his own. He did have individuality, though it was not he alone, but also the ethos of his age that found utterance in his poetry. He was the poet laureate, but we can even call him the national poet without any hesitation. He indeed fixed for the future generations the essence and the spirit of his age. He did not concern himself much with the externals of contemporary life, such as the international conflicts. Except for the Crimean War, we will find little mention of contemporary upheavals and conflicts in his poetry. But the deeper currents of contemporary thought and feeling run in his poetic compositions and are worthy of examination by a student of the Victorian ethos. In this sense, he bears a curious resemblance to Chaucer, the unofficial chronicler of the later 14th century. Page 248. Alfred Tennyson, 1809 to 1892. O young mariner, you from the heaven, under the sea cliff, you that are watching the grey magician with eyes of wonder, I am Merlin, and I am dying, I am Merlin who follow the gleam, O young mariner, down to the heaven, cap your companions, launch your vessel, and crowd your canvas, and, ere it vanishes over the margin, after it, follow it, follow the gleam, para. One who reads this haunting poem of Merlin and the Gleam finds in it a suggestion of the spirit of the poet's whole life, his devotion to the ideal as expressed in poetry, his early romantic impressions, his struggles, doubts, triumphs, and his thrilling message to his race. Throughout the entire Victorian period, Tennyson stood at the summit of poetry in England. Not in vain was he appointed laureate at the death of Wordsworth in 1850. For almost alone among those who have held the office, he felt the importance of his place and fined and honored it. For nearly half a century, Tennyson was not only a man and a poet, he was a voice, the voice of a whole people, expressing in exquisite melody their doubts and their faith, their griefs and their triumphs. In the wonderful variety of his verse, he suggests all the qualities of England's greatest poets. The dreaminess of Spenser, the majesty of Milton, the natural simplicity of Wordsworth, the fantasy of Blake and Coleridge, the melody of Keats and Shelley, the narrative vigor of Scott and Byron, all these striking qualities are evident on successive pages of Tennyson's poetry. The only thing lacking is the dramatic power of the Elizabethans. In reflecting the restless spirit of this progressive age, Tennyson is as remarkable as Pope was in voicing the artificiality of the early 18th century. As a poet, therefore, who expresses not so much a personal as a national spirit, he is probably the most representative literary man of the Victorian era.